Right, so we are recording now, and we'll start the meeting proper in a moment when the number of people coming in has slowed down. The chat is enabled, so you are very welcome to use the chat function during the meeting. Right, I think we should start the meeting, Andy. I think we've got a lot of people in. If I could ask you and Alan, while I'm starting the meeting off, if you can just keep on letting people in as they arrive, that would be great. Thank you very much indeed. Right. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening for this live interview organised by the Left Lane. This is the first one we've organised since we relaunched as a standalone newspaper website on May Day of this year. My name's Carol Taylor, and I'm a board member and a writer at the Left Lane. Given the news that's broken over the past couple of days with Reform's Nigel Farage resigning his seat to hold a by-election in a desperate bid to save his political skin, the subject we're addressing tonight, namely the far right, is even more relevant and topical than ever. Tonight we're going to be talking to Daniel Trilling, author of If We Tolerate This, How the British Establishment Made the Far Right Respectable. Daniel's argument cuts right against the comfortable story that the far right's rise is just some grassroots wave that caught us all unawares. His book makes the strong case that it was enabled, normalised, and in places actively encouraged by the people running the country, politicians, media, and institutions. Daniel is well placed to speak on this subject. He has studied and written on nationalism, migration, and human rights for many years, including for publications like the London Review of Books, The Guardian, and the New York Times. His work has been shortlisted for the Orwell Prize, the Political Book Awards, and the Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing. Daniel, thank you for joining us this evening. You're very welcome. And now, to conduct the interview with Daniel and to moderate the discussion, I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague, fellow director, and senior editor at The Left Lane, Andy Walker. So it's over to you now, Andy.
Thanks very much, Carol, and thanks again for Daniel for coming this evening. We'll obviously give you good promotion for the book, which I've just got in my hand there, which I thought was an absolutely excellent read. And actually, many of the points that are in there you wouldn't necessarily hear in the mainstream media. Maybe that's not such a big surprise. It's certainly a book with real teeth, actually, and I hope our audience tonight will have some teeth as well. So please do feel free either to put some questions in the chat for Daniel. We obviously do have some of our own for him as well. But also, if you want to ask the question on screen, then either signal that in the chat or basically just put your hand up, and we'll try and put as many to Daniel in the hour that we've actually got available. So once again, Daniel, really happy to have you here. As I said earlier, I really enjoyed reading this book, and your central claim that the far right's rise wasn't inevitable but was cultivated. Can you walk us through kind of the mechanics of that? What specifically, in your view, did the establishment do or fail to do that created that opening for the likes of Farage and some of the other ghouls that we see around about the place?
Yeah, I suppose the argument I make in my book, and before I go further, thanks very much for inviting me and hosting me this evening. And yeah, I'm very happy to answer people's questions after we have our formal discussion as well. But in the book, what I was trying to do with that book, so I've been a journalist for around 20 years now and have been covering right-wing nationalism and far-right politics for much of that time, and seen elements of that grow from being very marginal into being, you know, a major current in British and international politics today. With this book, what I was trying to do was give readers as clear and concise an account as I could of why that's happening here in the UK right now, and then give readers at least the tools to think about what to think with for what to do about it. And I'd say there's kind of three elements to that argument. One is the nature of far right politics itself, how that's changed over time, and what the far right itself is trying to do. And then the other two parts of the argument are really about the bit you just asked me about, sort of why has this happened now, and whose fault is it beyond the people at the forefront of these movements. And I would say it splits into two, really. There's one part of the political establishment that has invited this in, really, by trying to adopt the same kind of political techniques that have been pioneered on the far right, particularly right-wing populism. And another part of the political establishment that has seen its role as to kind of keep this stuff at bay, but its tactics have actually, as far as I'm concerned, involved actually that they've entailed pandering to the far right, failing to challenge the narratives and ideas that the far right have thrived on, and so are, as I would say, equally responsible for where we've got to today. To sum it up as crudely as possible, just for the sake of brevity now, I mean, the way that I split that up in the book really is to talk about the Conservative Party on the one hand and the Labour Party on the other. So I think you can't understand the growth of far-right populism in Britain in our own time without seeing it as very, very closely linked to the collapse of the Conservative Party as the hegemonic force on the centre-right. And I think for me, the real deciding factor there is the way that the Conservatives responded to the Brexit vote of 2016 and ended up with a way forwards that involved trying to bring far-right populism on board and make it part of their programme, notably under Boris Johnson from 2019 onwards. That was clearly a huge failure, and what it's led to is the almost total, for the moment, disintegration of the Conservative Party as an electoral force. But it also has not only then opened up political space for challengers to the right of the Tories, but has kind of helped push far right ideas and language and narratives right into the mainstream of British politics. And then the other part of that, crudely speaking, is I think the way the Labour Party has behaved over the last 5 years at least, which is to completely fail to rise to the challenge of the moment, to see that the reason far-right politics has grown so alarmingly and so rapidly is because of serious structural problems in Britain, and failed to put forward meaningful solutions to those. Failed to offer a meaningful political alternative, but then when it's come under far-right pressure, has either reacted with panic or has tried to pander to far-right ideas and claims itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was struck by how you frame the issue in the book, and you trace it all back through decades of neoliberal policy failure rather than just starting the clock more recently. For you, why is that longer time frame important, and what do we miss if we only look at some of the recent events like those riots that we've seen in the more recent period?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, if you look at it internationally, and think back a decade ago when there were the first big breakthroughs for our generation's far-right politicians and political movements, there was a lot of talk about how right-wing populism, as it was being described then was a kind of backlash against, or even perhaps an alternative to, globalization and neoliberalism. And clearly in what these movements are proposing and what they've done with the power that they've won, where they've won it, the alternative to neoliberalism or free market capitalism more broadly that they propose is not one that I think any of us here would favour, and it's questionable whether it's an alternative at all. Rather than an attempt to shore up the system and either let the market rip even more intensely through society, or just preserve the advantages that people who did well out of neoliberalism when it was working well were able to accumulate. But even though their solutions are not what I would call a meaningful alternative to the system as it was, their success, I think, you have to see as having been bred by the political settlement that we'd all been living under for several decades up to that point. So I mean, I started off working on this subject reporting on the BNP, the British National Party, who had unprecedented success for a far-right party in Britain at the time by winning seats in local government in the 2000s. Most of their successes were before the 2008 financial crash. So that tells you that in Britain, as in other parts of the world, far-right politics was already feeding from the discontent produced by, I would say, the huge inequality that neoliberalism presided over, and also the neutering of mainstream politics that was part and parcel of the neoliberal settlement. The idea that centre left and centre right converged on the same kind of ideas, and that large parts of economic life were simply removed from the political sphere and handed over to market forces or to Quango-like bodies to oversee. Far-right politics was already profiting from the discontents that these things generated when times were good economically. But after 2008, that's what really gave our current wave of far-right politics its big opening. And in Britain, that's obviously very closely linked to the way that governing elites responded to the 2008 financial crisis, and in particular, the Conservative-led programme of austerity from 2010 onwards, which first of all neutralised any substantial economic recovery after the crash because of the way that austerity was, because of how extreme a program of austerity was rolled out after 2010, but also by attacking what was left of the welfare state by taking money and resources out of public control and away from communities. I think had a huge effect on intensifying discontent that was already there. Not so much, I think a mistake the left often makes is to think that economic hardship pushes people to vote for the far right or support far right movements. I think in extremis that can certainly be the case. We saw that in Greece with Golden Dawn after 2008, which was in a much more extreme situation. What has happened in countries like Britain is that, a sluggish recovery from the crisis, stagnation, austerity policies and so on have just made people feel very, very frustrated about the direction of the country. They've made life incredibly hard for some groups of people, but those aren't necessarily the people who are attracted by what the far right has to offer. What I think far right politics, whether that's Tommy Robinson's street-based activity or a populist party like Reform UK, are picking up on is people's feeling that the country doesn't work as well as it used to, that while they might not be the worst off in their communities, they can feel their communities deteriorating and so on. So I think that's why I start there with what was going on around the turn of the 2010s. And then you have the more recent political factors that have come into play since that have sent it further along its path.
In the book, I was again struck by you really nail Labour for adopting it, far right language and framing. It's not just the Tories that are traditionally to blame for this. Where do you draw the line between responding to public concern and actively legitimising far right narratives? And I can just ask you to just give shorter answers because I'm conscious of the fact that I want to get all these questions in. Thanks.
Sure. Well, I think politicians for a long time, politicians are the centre, and let's talk about the politics of immigration here, because this obviously in Britain, this is what a lot of the far right, this is what far right politics is centred on very frequently. There's a kind of, and I suppose this is the neoliberal way of doing politics, that if you have, converged on broadly the same sets of ideas in the centre of politics, then politics becomes a game of keeping different interest groups happy and triangulating to keep people on side when they get discontented. And I think there's been, a long process, 20 years or more, of triangulating on immigration from both centre left and centre right. The logic being, a section of the population has got very upset or angry about immigration. A far right party or some other unpleasant extremist is profiting from that. Or our political opponents are hammering us over that. So what we've got to do is kind of meet that stuff halfway. So that's something that New Labour, did a lot of back in the 2000s. It's what David Cameron tried to do in the 2010s with promising a net migration target and various other things, and so that's been going on for a long time. And I've written about it for a long time and have always argued that that is actually a vicious cycle. By doing that, even if you've got kind of noble political intentions, you are just encouraging more of this stuff. So that's been going on for a long time. The change I think you had was with the Tories after 2016, and particularly after Boris Johnson got control of the party, where you saw extremist rhetoric coming from the top of government itself. Suella Braverman talking about channel crossings as an invasion and so on. And then what you have now, the Labour Party has always been capable of making reactionary and bigoted statements and the rest of it. But it's not had a programme to do that in such a comprehensive way. But I think what we've had in the last 2 years is a much worse version of that kind of triangulation process, partly because times have got harder, but partly because I think the Starmer leadership just had such a kind of ideological void at its centre. Pleasing the right was basically the only button they had to push, and it's been disastrous for us. We're now living with the consequences.
Just on that then, in your view, is there a politician or a policy moment, if you like, that you see as a genuine turning point? I mean, could there have been a different choice could have been made to have changed the trajectory, or are we just on a one-way ticket to disaster as far as this is concerned? What's your view?
Well, I think longer term, there has been a kind of breakdown in a sort of traditional post-war principle of drawing a line between the centre and the far right. And certainly a different politician at the head of the Conservative Party could have taken a different decision about how much of what the far right were doing they were willing to bring on board. I personally wouldn't put much faith in that happening, because I think the Tories were going through this structural collapse that made some version of what Boris Johnson did almost inevitable. For me, the turning point, and the one that I think is more useful for the left to think about, is the summer of 2024. So I didn't have huge hopes from a Keir Starmer government. And this is, aside from mine or anybody else's personal feelings about how Starmer achieved power and what he did with it with the Labour, internally with the Labour Party, just on the face of it, their programme for government in 2024 looked incredibly meagre. And I thought, long term, that's not going to solve any problems, but there's probably going to be a period where they're able to just kind of stabilize things a bit. And that obviously did not happen. I mean, it was, it failed to meet even those very low expectations. But I think in terms of dealing with pressure from the far right, the absolutely catastrophic thing was to basically absent themselves from the field, when what was really needed was a political challenge, both on the rhetorical level and then on the kind of vision for Britain and what you would do differently level. The response to the Southport riots in the summer, I think, was the first sign that something was really wrong on that front. You just got the kind of law and order crackdown response and no attempt to seize the narrative and say, well, actually, we're also against this because racism is a poison in our society and there is no justification for what's happening. But then as Labour got into more trouble over their lack of an effective programme for government and reform started to rise in the polls, you saw repeatedly these moments when this should have been challenged on its own merits, and all Labour would ever do was a version of that triangulation, and then made it even worse when Starmer did come out and do his big speech where he was supposed to change the narrative, because he then just adopted the language of the far right in a very alarming way, I think.
I think you're to be congratulated, quite frankly, for highlighting not just the obvious failures of the parties of the right, but also the parties of the so-called left as well, because as you've just explained there's no question that, particularly when we look at the events post Southport, it was a woeful response from Labour, and that focus on law and order, which you could say was predictable given the people who were advising Starmer, and Starmer himself at the time only effectively, literally in some cases, poured petrol on the fires of that. But I think, dare I say it, and as someone who has worked in the media, I am going to say it. The media has had a role to play, I think, in all of this. And the question I want to ask you, Daniel, is, and you do talk about this a little bit in the book, beyond politicians, what role do you assign to the media and to supposedly neutral organisations like the civil service or broadcasters? We know they're not neutral in reality, in laundering far-right ideas into the mainstream and almost legitimising it.
Yeah, well, I think obviously in Britain we've had a media that's heavily dominated by the right, and we've had that for well over a century, for about as long as mass media has really existed in Britain. So it's always been fertile ground for anti-immigration politics, for instance. It has always indulged populist type figures to the right of the mainstream. Nigel Farage's entire persona really is that of a Daily Mail or Daily Telegraph columnist from from several decades ago. I think that's why he works in a lot of people's minds, because he reminds them of a very familiar figure that anybody who has read those papers regularly will be very used to. And then the broadcast media, particularly the BBC, although those are formally politically neutral, tend to get pulled along by the overall tone and balance of the traditional press. And even today, with huge changes to media technology and so on, I think that dynamic is still true. So the short answer, I suppose, is that the media has played a huge role because it kind of helps set the terms of debate. It has always shaped and led Britain's conversation on immigration, for instance. The trickier part of the answer, though, is why now? So if you just, again, stick with immigration and take the Daily Mail as an example, the Daily Mail has been xenophobic for its entire existence. I've done research in the past where I've gone and looked at Daily Mail issues of the Daily Mail from around 1900, and they're having stories about gypsies stealing people's gold watches and stuff. Different targets of the xenophobia, same ingredients as you would see today. But for most of my lifetime, at least, all of that has been contained within the mainstream right. But only in the last decade or so has it all kind of broken down, and you've seen the far right kind of actually become a significant political force of its own. Part of that is to do with those changes politically that I was already talking about, the collapse of the Conservative Party. Where the media is concerned, it's that they're having to keep up with that. But I also think the way that social media has become such fertile ground for far right themes, and the way that social media has also transformed the traditional press to the extent that the press has become much more like Twitter than Twitter has become like the press, if you see what I mean. That's added a sort of further radicalizing factor on top of the ones that we've already discussed.
Thanks for that, Daniel. I'm just going to take a very brief pause here as we've been talking about the media, partly to give you a chance to maybe have a drink of water or whatever. But I just want to, obviously at the Left Lane, we're keenly engaged and involved in how the media covers all sorts of issues like this. And obviously we're trying to challenge a lot of those narratives by what we actually do. And I just want to bring Alan Story, who founded the original Left Lane, just in to say a few words about that kind of, why we're here and what we're trying to do. Alan, over to you.
Hi there, Andy. Hi there, Daniel. Nice to see you on the other side of the email. We've been back and forth for a while. Um, Yes, great interview, Andy. Andy and I are the old-time journalists in the left lane. Very good. It's really interesting. I'll be very brief. Um, yeah, this project started 2.5 years ago when I started a one-person Substack called The Left Lane. And after 2 years, I said, "Yeah, God, I'm 78 years of age. This is too much for one person. Let's bring on more people on board." And so we've now got more people on board. Uh, we've had, they don't all sort of on board all the time, but we've had 50 writers since the 1st of May producing I think it's about 150 articles. That's not too bad for a small group with no money, and we're just sort of getting working together. People are, let you out in a secret. I mean, Carol, for example, lives in Portugal. Darren, my mate Darren, lives in the Isle of Wight. John Bernard, I see on the call, lives in Spain. To sort of keep a production going is very, very difficult. And we think we've done a good success on this, but we need more people, and not just writers. I mean, of course, we want writers, and we do have, Andy and I are old dogs at this field. There's a person on the call here who I won't go mention, but like he submitted a draft, which wasn't too bad, but I then made some suggestions of how it could be better. And then he went out and did that. And well, I think it really was quite a lot better article. And so that's the kind of hands-on. We realize we're not talking, our staff is not made up of 50 experienced journalists like Daniel or Andy or me. We're just trying to sort of build it up. It's only been about 2 months now, but we need more people because there's so many stories going on around here. And that is one of the things we want to try and do is sort of be the an organ for, its quote, the progressive movement. I mean, Darren, for example, wrote a story on the growth, the founding or whatever of the Socialist Federation. That got 1,700 views. We were first on the block of that story, a good story. And we're trying to be that kind of sort of the Daily Mail for the left. No, that's just a joke. But and we're trying to do those kind of stories, longer investigative stories. I just did a piece on what's happening in your party, the suspensions of people. So we're trying to piece of that movement sort of publication, but also longer kind of detailed exposés. Sort of go beyond the headlines. So if you'd like to join us, I'll put in the chat. I'll put in my own personal email, and you can contact me. We'll have a Zoom chat, talk about maybe what you'd like to write about, and go from there. And the other thing is, our main, just getting started is by having subscribers, which are people then can get this publication, we call it that, into their email quite regularly. So come on in, folks. We're really welcome. We're a friendly bunch. I'll go back to you, Andy and Daniel.
Thanks for that, Alan. And we put some of those links in the chat already. So, yeah, I mean, if people are interested, they've got things to say, then, obviously get in touch. We'd love to have you on board. Turning back to the issue in hand and looking, if I may, Daniel, at the 2025 riots and this whole, Tommy Robinson, I won't call it a phenomenon or whatever he calls himself on any given day. Last September's 150,000 strong march was obviously it was the largest far right mobilisation in British history. And I don't know about anyone else on the call, but I was pretty frightened by seeing that. I never thought I'd ever see something like that in the country in which I live. It's the sort of thing you normally see on a news bulletin from some far off place, but it was happening in the here and now. I mean, from your perspective, Daniel, what made that moment possible? Was it just a culmination of all those trends that you describe in the book? Or do you think we've seen something specific change?
Yeah, well, I mean, on top of the trends that that we've discussed a bit already. I think you have to see that Unite the Kingdom march and a lot of the other things that have cropped up over the last year or two as also the culmination of these changes in I think changes in technology, but also the far right being emboldened by its successes internationally and coordinating more than they had previously. So, I mean, on the latter, the key factor there, I think, is Trump's second victory in the US and the fact that Trump's administration plus some of its high-profile supporters have really invested in boosting far-right politics in other parts of the world, and particularly Britain, because to them there's something kind of symbolic about Britain to the American far right, I think. Europe perhaps more generally, but I guess partly because of the shared language, Britain's the one that is the focus, that it's the symbol of everything that's gone wrong with immigration and multiculturalism and woke elites, and the right here needs to be boosted to build this new sort of civilizational fight back, or however they see it. And the key player there obviously is Elon Musk, who has lent both rhetorical and practical and financial support to far-right causes in Britain, including Tommy Robinson's. But it's also the nature of the platform that he owns and operates, I think, has just become, Tommy Robinson is a creation of social media. And I'm not an anti-social media person. I don't think it's an inherently right-leaning form. In fact, it's actually got huge democratizing potential, as Alan was just describing with the left lane. It enables all of us to do media in ways that we previously might not have had the opportunity to, but it is heavily skewed, like everything else in our world, by money and by who owns the means of production. And social media has become a field that is very conducive to far right politics, I think, for two reasons. One, because nowadays you've had far right billionaires look at it and think, actually, we could use this to really influence things directly. And that's what Elon Musk has done. But also the way that platforms are designed and operated, they're operated by large profit making corporations who allow content to be served to people via algorithmic processes that are designed to keep people engaged on those sites as much as possible, which the shortest route to which is make them angry. And far right influencers like Tommy Robinson have been adept at exploiting that to their advantage. And I think in the 2020s, we've just seen that reach a critical mass. And so that, in combination with the longer term structural political changes that we talked about earlier, I think is what has brought us to this point where we now, every year now for the last 3 years, have seen these outbursts of far right anger, even mass violence on the streets, all of it marshaled by these, not traditional political leaders, but these influencers who can encourage things and then walk away from the consequences.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned some of these so-called influencers. I mean, what do you think about the relationship between maybe more legitimate, in inverted commas, figures, MPs, columnists, some of the think tanks that are out there, and precisely those street level figures like Tommy Robinson? I mean, are they part of the same project, or is that too simple?
I'd say they're part of the same collection of things, and that it makes sense to see them as all part of the same thing for that reason. And that's why when I use the term far right in my book and my other writings, I'm talking both about the extremist stuff and the street-based stuff, and the stuff that is often euphemized as simply populism. So for me, the far right in Britain is something that stretches from Nigel Farage and Reform UK all the way to Tommy Robinson, all the way further than that to kind of neo-Nazi groups and groups that are anti-democratic and engaged in violence. And the reason why I think it's important to see them all as at least overlapping with one another is that although they've got very different attitudes to, say, democracy in the electoral process, they are all fishing in the same waters. They are all trading in radical forms of right-wing nationalism. And they are all promising the public some kind of insurrection against the elites, some kind of uprising that is going to both sort of liberate people and revolutionize society, and at the same time restore and reinforce traditional social hierarchies. And that's at the core of far right politics of any sort throughout the ages. And it's what makes it so potentially destructive, because even when people engaged in it think that they're just playing with this stuff and they've got more moderate aims than the more extreme elements to their right, they are essentially promising people something that can't be fulfilled and opening up a process by which things can get more extreme, even perhaps when its figureheads don't intend them to. And a good example of that, I would argue, is if you look at Nigel Farage over the last 2 years. Look at his response to the Southport murders in 2024, and then his response to the revelations about the murder of Henry Novak a few weeks ago here, where in 2024, he did his traditional kind of nudge and a wink mode of engaging in politics, where in that information vacuum after the murders, when false claims were being made about the identity of the perpetrator, all Farage said was, the police, what aren't the police telling us? They should come clean and tell us the whole story. He left it to other people to fill in those gaps there. After the Henry Novak revelations this year, he gave a markedly more extreme statement on social media. He said people should respond with pure cold rage and that white lives matter. And the reason why Farage, and you can see him having done this on various different measures, he's moved rightwards because he's opened up something that he's not fully in control of, and he's having to race to the right to keep up with where it's going. And so for that reason, even in its more moderate guises, I think it's important to see this form of politics as far right politics, something distinct from mainstream centre right politics as we know it, and potentially very, very dangerous.
So we've covered the media, we've covered, some of the so-called established parties. We're obviously quite interested as well in the left's response to all of this. You're clear that none of this was inevitable and can be reversed. But in your view, what has the left in Parliament, in unions, in media like ours, maybe got wrong in responding to the far right's rise today?
Yeah. Maybe I'll split that into two and talk about the kind of mainstream centre left, and then the rest of us, people in unions, people who are just, engaged in this, committed to this on other levels. I think the centre left was, it made its grand Faustian pact with neoliberalism, much like the centre left in other similar countries. It worked for a while, but in Britain at least has been completely unable to date to adapt to the failure of neoliberalism and to deal with the discontents that have arisen. And another, I think, catastrophic decision by the Starmer government was to look at Britain in 2024 and say, basically, nothing's that radically wrong. We need more noble and competent management at the top, and that'll be fine. Andy Burnham, at least, is showing signs that he's aware that something bigger is needed. Obviously, it would have been better if that had been, acknowledged and attended to by the Labour Party in about 2010 or so. But here we are. For everybody else, I think the main problem is we've not been able to build an alternative that has been durable and successful enough. And I think the main reason why is it's really difficult. In terms of actual mistakes, I think I'll just say like one common thing that I think I see with the kind of pattern of left-wing responses to far-right politics over the years, that at least as I've observed it, one is a temptation to reduce it to economics. Whereas, as I think hopefully you've seen from the way I've described it earlier, I think obviously there is a clear link to economic conditions, but it's not a kind of direct causal link. It's not that people get hungry and then they'll go and vote for a far-right politician who's blaming a convenient scapegoat. Most of the time, it's actually about a lot of people are just really, get disaffected and are angry and don't vote for the far right. And actually, it's more about, well, what can you do to build something that brings people together on a completely different basis and builds confidence and builds people's agency. And then the other problem that I think is sort of linked to that is a tendency to treat anti-racism and anti-fascist campaigns as sort of something separate from everything else, that they're a sort of add-on, that, oh, well, when it gets bad, you need to organize a big march and tell people not to be racist. And then we'll go back to talking about what we're really more comfortable talking about, which is, economic policy or bringing public services into public ownership and all of that. And actually, I think the left needs to be better at treating this as a single thing, and the way that they come together, as far as I can see it, is you're talking about collective life and collective belonging. The far right have got a very strong argument about collective life and collective belonging that appeals to a minority of the population, but they're very successful at leveraging that. The left has potentially got one, and it's a harder task for the left because you build collective life on the left by doing things together. You can't just go onto your favored media platform and spout a bunch of demagogic nonsense in the way that the far right is able to do. But I think that there is a tendency on the left to think, well, so long as we got the economic bits right, the other stuff will just slot into place. And it won't, in my opinion.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to actually take a couple of questions because they are coming in. So I've got one from I'm just going to read this straight out the chat and get you to answer it. From Brian in the chat, Brian Green. He's asking, has the reform right peaked? Farage's disapproval rating has risen sharply. Trump's unpopularity is dragging all of the right down in Europe and so on. What's your view on that? And if I can just ask you to sort of, frame the reply briefly, if you can, because I do have quite a number of questions I want to get to.
Yeah, I mean, in short, yeah, I think they're in real trouble now. And I think that's because it is difficult to sustain a political movement coming from outside the mainstream and to build it. But it's also, I think there's this inherent contradiction that's always there in far right politics that is what I was describing earlier, that makes it potentially very dangerous, that it can go, it's got a dynamic of its own that even the people running the thing aren't fully in charge of. And that can push it towards becoming more extreme, which can be very dangerous, obviously, but it can also really mess up a party's prospects for building a broader electoral coalition. And actually, the way Farage has moved over the last couple of years, I don't think has been that helpful for reform, because what it's doing is putting off the more moderate voters that it needs to win over. My final word of caution on that, though, is that we can't just expect the internal weaknesses and contradictions to do the job for us. That just buys us breathing space. But, even if this is curtains for Farage, someone else will eventually emerge who can do what he does.
Thanks. I'm just going to turn to the chat. I've got a couple of people got the hands up, and I'm going to turn. We're going to just ask people to ask a question because we haven't got unlimited time, and be as brief as you possibly can. I'm going to go to Mike Phipps first to ask his question. Mike.
Hi, thanks. I very much agree with your presentation, Daniel, and I just wondered if I could throw in a couple of other elements, particularly in relation to the violent far right and what we've seen after the Southall riots and the pogroms in Northern Ireland. And I wonder whether you would agree that although it cannot be reduced to simple economic causes, we must say that the rise in social inequality has actually led simultaneously to a massive decline in human empathy, which allows far right demagogues to feed into a kind of them and us mentality. And just to add to that, the global context, not just the money that pours in internationally from the Elon Musks and the others that at one point made Tommy Robinson the best finance politician in the country. It's also, would you not agree, a situation where you have government and opposition both basically turning a blind eye to or even approving, for example, Israeli war crimes, which creates a situation where people feel that violence in society is normalized as a way of achieving your goals. After all, if it's legitimate for Israel to bomb a library in the West Bank or in Gaza, why is it not legitimate to burn down a library in Southall or Northern Ireland? So the global human rights crisis also normalizes a situation in which the far right, the violent far right, can flourish. And I just wondered if you had a thought on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Daniel?
Yeah, thanks for those. The social inequality point, I absolutely agree. And sort of to clarify what I was saying earlier, it's that I think the note of caution I have there is in just recognizing that it's not necessarily the people who are hurting the most who are supporting the far right, either electorally or engaging in the violence. Like, I went through the profiles of the people that rioted after Southport for a piece I was writing 2 years ago, and it's a mix. These things are always a mix. They, you know, the disturbances took places. The disturbances took place in some of the most deprived bits of England. But the people arrested, you know, if you go through the profiles of who was arrested and charged and convicted, lots of those people were quite well off small business owners and self-employed tradespeople. So it's I think it's, you put it well, actually. It's the effect that all of that has on kind of social trust and empathy for one another and how you feel about your community. On the second point, I think it's really important to raise. I mean, I think this is kind of where we're at globally. That you know, for all the failures of the post-war system of human rights and so-called liberal international order and so on, there at least was lip service paid to these basic standards of how we should treat one another. At the moment, as the world has become a more dangerous place and as we're faced with you know, existential threats from climate crisis and so on, the far right have got a potentially very seductive answer to all of that, which is to say, well, all this stuff, it was rubbish anyway. The only thing that matters in this world is might is right and punishing other people and dominating them and being on top. And I do think the longer that governments of the centre or the left fails to kind of present an alternative to this, the longer that governments of the centre kind of go along with the collapse of these standards, the more appealing that message from the far right gets.
Thanks for that. I just want to bring someone else in from the audience, Darren Galpin, if Darren can ask his question. Darren.
Yeah, thank you, Andy, and hello, Daniel. And all very interesting. One thing you haven't touched on, and it'd be nice if you could say a few words about this, is who's funding it all. I'm presently reading Dark Money by Peter Gagan. Yeah, you know that book. I thought you
Brilliant
might.
book.
Yeah, and which, you know, gives a good history of you know, who's funded it, and also chronicles the role of the you know, big tech and also kind of smaller sort of tech disruptors, if you like, in fomenting the rise of the right. But I mean, obviously, like there's the hedge funds loom large in the funding, and and also some of these, like the sort of big kind of dealers, like the crypto dealers, like obviously, which is very much in the news at the moment. I mean, what are the motivations there? Because obviously, the hedge funders funded donated to the Tories throughout the Cameron years, and also, you know, have funded Labour as well. And I think they are a different type of capitalism to the old bricks and mortar capitalism, and they do rely on a disruption of the order. You know, they're not relying on stable markets and stable workforce, etc., etc. Maybe I don't want to go too far and answer the question as well as ask it for you, Daniel. But yeah, I mean, could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, what I was going to say is you've gone a fair bit of the way towards answering it for us there. But I'll add a couple of things. I think the money that's getting behind the far right now, I think you've got to see it as it's a couple of things going on at once. One big bit of it is that I think it's a wing of capital that has got frustrated at the inability of traditional governing elites to deliver the kind of profits that it wants, and that it tends to be those parts of capital that, as you say, either thrive from or aren't that bothered by chaos and disruption, and also that really kind of benefited from like the most sort of Ayn Randian aspects of neoliberalism, you know, kind of everyone for themselves type ideology. You can just see that in the backgrounds of all the money men at the top of Reform. You know, Farage, Richard Tice, Zia Yusuf. You've got someone who benefited. You know, Farage made his start in the City of London the year of the Big Bang deregulation. Loved it, profited personally from it. Richard Tice has made all of his money out of rentier capital, essentially, property development. And Zia Yusuf made his millions being a butler to the world's super rich with a luxury concierge company. As well as that, I think, though, you've got very rich people who are just ideologically committed to certain things. So Paul Marshall, the backer of GB News, you know, has got a big Christian fundamentalist aspect to his worldview. And then you've got kind of causes that there are some very wealthy backers of that come into play as well. So Tommy Robinson, for instance, has received quite a lot of money over the years from pro-Israel and Islamophobic wealthy people in the US and North America. So I suppose where all of those things come together is that the far right now, and particularly at that top level and the money level, they're kind of converging on these set of ideas that say, we'll unleash the power of capitalism by, you know, slashing away at this and that, and at the same time we'll keep the populations that we need to keep on side by offering this new sort of civilizationist you know, nationalist or ethno-nationalist kind of cultural ideology to bolster it. So I suppose that's where those two sets of interests overlap.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks, Darren, for that question. If I can just bring Steve Freeman in next, who's got his hand up and who has a question.
Well,
Steve.
It's probably more a comment really than a specific question, although comments always lead to questions.
Yeah, can I just say that we've got limited time, Steve, so try and keep it brief if you can.
Okay, so we might want to explain why fascism came to Germany in the 1930s and didn't come to Britain in the 1930s. There's something going on in Britain in the 1930s and in Germany. In Britain in the 1930s, we had a British imperial monarchy. Germany had an unstable Weimar Republic. And in those conditions, fascism could thrive in Germany. It didn't really thrive in this country. Now, we have to transfer that idea to say, where are we today in Britain? Is Britain the Weimar Republic of Europe, if you like, at this moment? Is our political system now highly unstable? So unstable. I believe that we have to understand the nature of an epoch. We're at the end of the historical epoch of our constitutional and social monarchy. Therefore, we're living in a state of a degenerated social monarchy where things are dying. And if you have a wounded animal, the birds of prey and the vultures will come and feed on the body, because even if the body is the sixth biggest economy in the world, when it's dying and on its feet, then the vultures will come. So I think we do need a strategy, a different strategy to what's normally offered by the left, because mass fascism is possible. And I think the last point is this: when Tommy Robinson marches with 100 to 150,000 people under the slogan, "Unite the Kingdom," the left has to think about why that slogan is something in this period of collapse and degeneration. That slogan, we need to, what's the answer? Do we want to unite the kingdom, or what is it? What's our answer to that slogan? Not just dismiss it. So that's where that takes me in, should I say, Daniel, to all these questions of identity, what is Englishness, which we haven't been mentioned, which is also part of that. So I think there's a big conversation here. And I agree with what you're generally agreeing with what you're saying. It's a shame, therefore, my last little complaint, I suppose, I can't avoid on this one. I did write a little piece, a short piece on the nature of the epoch. And unfortunately, Left Lane didn't want to publish it. So that's a shame, I think. Anyway.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Obviously, I can't speak on behalf of the Left Lane there, but I think you're right in your earlier point about what's different now. Things are much less stable. But I would just add to that also, I think far-right politics has found a way to adapt itself the far right politics we're confronted with now is in certain key aspects very different from mass fascist politics of the 1920s and 1930s. It has adapted itself to electoral systems, and then therefore that's allowed it to make inroads much more effectively in the time that we live in for the moment. But and hopefully, as you could see from what I was saying earlier, I don't think that means it's any less dangerous necessarily, but it does imply that we think about our tactics in response accordingly. You know, we have to think about what are the weaknesses and strengths of the movements that we're faced with now, and how do we respond to those.
Thanks very much for that. And I've got Phil Vellender, who has got a question, and then I've got a couple of brief questions to wrap things up with Daniel. Go, take it away, Phil.
Okay. Yes, I think my note, which I put in the chat, is that in 26 and 33 in the last century, liberal sort of centre-right parties paved the way for fascism. My great problem is, and not enough people are willing to break with the Labour Party on the left. They still have some sort of sad, I mean, it's obviously many have gone to the Greens, but there's still a core of people who are believing that the Labour Party can somehow salvage something with Burnham. And I think Burnham has completely misunderstood the nature of what's going on. And I think part of it is, obviously, he's talking about devolution and constitutional matters, which interests me, but he's not really dealing with the fact, the economistic nature that you hit upon, that the left agrees with the right. We don't need to do anything about reforming the state. We leave it as it is. And we'll deal with that in the left case after the revolution, in the right case, because we're conservatives, we don't want to change anything. So I wonder what you think about that, because surely the cure for fascism is democracy. That's what you need. And these individual campaigns that we had in the 70s, like Anti-Nazi League and so on, don't look like they're going to be able to be put together again now.
Yeah.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's a very good way of putting it, that the cure is democracy. And yes, I agree. I don't think Burnham, as Burnham sort of shows, he knows Burnham is making the right kinds of noises. I don't have much faith in the Labour Party, the Labour government as it currently is, to actually follow through on those. And I think the only way that will happen is by all of the rest of us working to build something that is more democratic. It's just that looking at the way that the political system is fragmented across the UK at the moment, it's going to have to come from a variety of different traditions and movements. So I live in London. For me, the most important route to, in the long term, to stopping the far right succeeding where I live is that my newly elected Green Council makes a real success of governing in the interests of the people that live where I live. That it doesn't just rhetorically challenge the government at a national level or challenge Nigel Farage, but shows that it's got another way of doing things that can, for instance, adapt to the very hot council-owned building that I'm sitting in right now to a much hotter environment. In other parts of the country, it's going to be a different movement or different party that's best placed to do that. But I think that really, to me, is the only way to get past where we are now.
Thanks, Daniel. You end the book, I think, on a very optimistic note, and you actually give some practical tools for how to fight back against this stuff. In your view, what's the single most concrete and maybe actionable thing that you'd want a reader who reads the book, or even someone watching this now, or when we put it on YouTube later, what would you want them to do or do differently?
So the single thing I would want anybody who's come across this talk or who reads my book to think is that their voice counts, that it is worth objecting whoever you are and wherever you are. And the reason why, obviously, because it always makes a difference, even if it's only a small one, but it's also because I think one of the symptoms of the way that politics has deteriorated in Britain, certainly over the time that I've been aware of it, is this the kind of growth and persistence of this idea that there's only certain people within our country whose views count, and that varies. Sometimes it's when it's basically when there's a challenge from the left, then it's these people aren't kind of elite and refined enough and haven't been educated in the right way and aren't experts in XYZ field to qualify to have an opinion. And then when it's support for far right politics, it's that, well, the areas of the country that vote for Reform UK, they're the authentic areas, and anyone who challenges them is inauthentic because they come from a big city, and more than that, it completely erases the fact that even within, say, a very strongly reform voting county in England at the moment, there are tons of people, perhaps more than there are people who strongly support reform, who actually really oppose what they stand for. And I think the differences between the different parts of Britain and between communities are heavily overstated in our national political conversation. And what that leads to is this kind of paralysis and feeling like my voice doesn't count. I don't like this, but I haven't really got a say here because I'm this kind of person, or I haven't been to that kind of school or that kind of university. And so it's for that reason I think just ignoring all of that and making your views heard is the most important thing that you can do.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. I think I'm probably going to leave it there, but just before we wrap things up, when I reviewed your book, I made the point and quoting what you said in the book, and you said that it was in our hands. We don't have to accept this, and we can fight back. Now, obviously, an audience like this knows that you can fight back, but I think sometimes it's important to actually hear that across the board. And I think, you've certainly done, us a real service by explaining some of the points that you've talked about this evening, and also by writing the book in the first place. So I'd just like to thank you, Daniel, for coming along tonight. You've certainly given us a lot to think about and also a lot to discuss, judging by the chat. Just to remind people, the book again is If We Tolerate This, How the British Establishment Made the Far Right Respectable. And I'd urge everybody to go and get it. Either get it out of the library, because I think Daniel will get a cut from that, as well as if you order it from a bookshop. In fact, I always ask this of authors when I speak to them: where would you rather people bought it from, Daniel, so you get more money?
Well, I always say either get it from your local independent bookshop, or there's a very good website called bookshop.org, which
marvelous,
allows you to order online, but the profits go to independent bookshops rather than Jeff Bezos.
Excellent. So you heard that straight from Daniel. Go to those websites or the library. I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us this evening. This is exactly the kind of debate that the Left Lane exists to host. We'll be organising more debates in the future. If you're not already a subscriber, please do sign up, because events like this only happen because of the readers who back us. And if you do have a spare couple of quid, feel free to drop us a donation as well on our GoFunding website. Thanks again to Daniel. Thanks to everyone for being here. We'll share a link to this session in due course, and there'll be a write-up of it. So please do share that with your networks and all socials. And we hope to see you at another Left Lane event very soon. Good night.